So you want to know how I turned this sketch into this final piece. I'll walk you through my process. So for this concept, I knew that I wanted to combine fuwamoco from Hololive with Two Heart, which is one of their favorite visual novels, and specifically I wanted to draw them as characters from Two Heart 2, the sequel. So then I hopped online and I looked up some artwork drawn by the artist and character designer for Two Heart 2, Misato Mitsumi. And the things that really stand out to me about her work are the way that she draws expressions, specifically the eyes, and her use of color. And so I really want to capture these when I'm making my piece. So I'll be studying all of my reference images pretty religiously. The drawing software that I use is Clip Studio Paint, and first thing that I did was drop 2 3D models in there and edit the proportions and poses to be what I wanted the final piece to look like. And so the nice thing about Clip Studio is that you have these 3D models and they're included whether you have Pro or EX, and everything about them is customizable. So it's a super helpful tool if you're not quite sure what a pose would look like from a certain angle, or you just need that little extra bit of help along the way. And so after I laid out those 3D models, I drew over them with my initial sketch, and then from there I cleaned it up into a second cleaner sketch that I would use as the base for drawing my line art. And we made it to the bread and butter! So here is the extremely time-consuming process of working on the line art. I don't typically work in a style that's this intricate, so it was kind of nice to have the opportunity to just sit down and work and challenge myself with a style that's got much thinner lines and a lot of detail put in. But that detail is something that I really, really admire and want to emulate when it comes to artwork from this era of the moe boom, which horrendously is somewhere in the ballpark of 25 years old. Two Heart 2 specifically just celebrated its 20th anniversary, which was part of the inspiration to make this in the first place. And despite feeling like an ancient dinosaur since I was there to experience some of the tail end of this, it's really put into perspective how much work and blood and sweat and tears and love go into making work like this. And so one last thing before I let you just sit back and enjoy the process. When I am working on a piece that requires this level of detail with the line work, I find that it's a lot easier to use a vector layer instead of a raster layer for the line art. And so the key difference is that a raster layer stores information with pixels, which you can't edit that easily without losing quality, say if you rescaled it or rotated it. But with a vector layer, you're able to do all of that without losing any quality. So you wouldn't really want to use it in a scenario where you're coloring or trying to blend. But if you're drawing something that has a lot of intersecting lines, or you want to adjust the line width, you can do that really easily with vector layers without spending a ton of time having to go in and edit it like you would if you did it by hand. The feature that I use the most, as you can see, is erasing lines that intersect without having to go in and zoom in 500% and do it by hand and make sure there's no stray pixels. So it's not a tool that you have to use necessarily, but it could improve your workflow if you find that you spend a lot of time having to go in and clean up your line art. And it was at this point I accidentally misclicked back into my OBS window and lost the rest of the line art for Mococo, which, unfortunate, but it happens. Thankfully, the whole line art process was saved in the time lapse, which is playing now. Laying down the flat colors is pretty straightforward. I'm just hopping right in there with the paint bucket tool. But the first thing that I wanted to try and figure out was how to render the eyes. So I'm not exactly sure of the method that Misato Mitsumi uses when she draws, so I'm kind of just eyeballing it and looking at my reference. But with a combination of a watercolor brush and the airbrush tool, I ended up with something that more or less seems close to my reference. And then again, I'm just going in and filling in the rest of the flat colors with the paint bucket tool and the G pen where I need more fine control. So here I'm starting the rendering process, and a lot of Misato Mitsumi's work has this really soft look. Like, a lot of the shadows don't have hard edges. So I'm using pretty light pen pressure and a brush that blends very easily. I also wasn't really digging the eyes 100% at this point, so just tweaked them a little bit, but I feel like it made a big difference, and I'm much happier with how they turned out in the final image. And then I moved on to the hair, and I'm using a brush that has a little bit more of a hard edge to it. It still blends really easily and can look soft if you want to, depending on how much pen pressure you use. And I will link this brush set in the description because you can get it free from the Clip Studio asset store. And when it comes to hair, I'm just separating it into different chunks. Like, you don't want to over render it. And I add the highlights in on a second layer. And then after I blocked in all of the shadows that I wanted to work with, I make a second pass at it with some new colors to help it feel less flat. You'll see when it's finished, but I feel like it makes a big difference to use some variation in your color when you're rendering. The clothes, I use a little bit of a different approach. In all of my reference images, I noticed that Misato Mitsumi uses a hard edge on one side that kind of blends out into a softer edge in certain parts of the fabric. So again, I'm basically just eyeballing the reference until I get something that feels close to what I'm going for. And then I got a little sidetracked. I wanted to add some texture and some color adjustments, so what I did there was just kind of a teaser. And then I went back to the hair. You don't have to do everything all in a specific order all of the time. Like, even here, I just got bored and started working on the flats for fuwawa. But that's the beauty of being an artist. You can do what you want when you want, in whatever order you want. The process to set up the flats for fuwawa is exactly the same as what I did to set up mococo's. It was actually easier to work on her after I used mococo as a test subject. Once all the flats were done, I just kind of went into a zen mode and rendered out the rest of both of them, really. So eyes, hair, clothes, accessories, just going one thing at a time. It's actually one of my favorite parts of getting to work on something. It's like a reward. And you may have noticed it earlier, but the way that I set this file up, each of the girls is a complete illustration on its own, but I went in and used a layer mask to separate the parts where they overlap so I could position them together for the final art. And I don't do that too often, but it was actually really handy, so I think I will be using that technique more in the future. So here's how I wrapped it up. I exported the art of the two of them together and I dropped it onto a new canvas, and what I'm trying to achieve here with this background is a mid-late 2000s visual novel cutesy print graphic. So I'm throwing in a lot of textures, a lot of gradients, a lot of gradient maps, and layer effects, and combining them all to make this final image. I didn't have a particular reference when putting this together, just vibes until I was happy with it. And here's some close-ups in the final images. I feel like I learned a lot while I was working on this. It's always a challenge to move out of your comfort zone. And I'd highly recommend doing something like this if you're looking for new ways to challenge yourself with your art. So this is my first time doing voiceover. Was it helpful? Did you learn anything? If you did, leave a comment. Let me know if you want to see more. That's all I got for this time though, so bye!